The galaxy once whispered that humans were too chaotic to be trusted, too wild to be left free. That was their excuse. The Soren, the first species to approach Earth, offered trade and peace, but behind their gifts were shackles. The Jeri rewrote our laws, deciding which children could be born. The Kethari sedated our soldiers with neural implants. The Valnar controlled our airwaves and erased our history, and Earth complied, believing it was progress. But Kalen Rhine, born as labor property, saw the truth. One night, with nothing but a jagged pipe, he ripped the control node from his skull. As blood poured down his face, he felt it for the first time, his own thoughts, his own fire. They wanted obedience. Instead, they gave birth to fury. Kalen Rhine vanished into the shadows of Drosvin Reach, far from Concord law, and it was there that his path and humanity's reckoning truly began. Kalen Rhine stepped off the transport platform into the choking haze of Drosvin Reach, a world carved from the remains of forgotten wars. The air smelled of rust and ash, heavy with the stench of fuel leaking from broken pipes that no one had cared to repair for decades. Above him, ships limped through the sky, patched with scrap metal and painted with symbols of pirate clans, mercenary crews and traders who no longer belonged anywhere. Drosvin Reach was not a place of hope. It was where the galaxy threw its unwanted, the exiles, the criminals, the ones who had refused to kneel yet had nowhere left to stand. The narrow streets were filled with hollow-eyed children picking through piles of discarded machinery, traders shouting half-heartedly to sell food grown in vats that reeked of chemicals, and refugees who stared at Kalen with the look of those who had already lost everything. As he walked deeper into the settlement, Kalen felt the weight of their silence. The Orales Concord had taken more than freedom, it had taken memory. Entire generations had been born believing they were meant to serve, that obedience was their nature. They had forgotten what it felt like to choose. Kalen understood now what the Concord truly feared. It was not humanity's strength. It was not weapons or armies. It was choice, the dangerous, unpredictable force of free will. A human who could think for himself could never be fully chained. Over the years, Kalen wandered from world to world, speaking little, always watching, always listening. He worked as a miner in the Ketharan belts, his hands blistered and raw. He joined smugglers as a silent partner, ferrying forbidden books and music banned by the Concord. He sat in the darkest corners of trade stations, learning the language of power, who controlled the fuel lines, who bought the weapons, who sold information. 2 decades passed before he returned to Drosvin Reach, not as a broken man, but as one who had learned how empires rot from the inside. On the edge of a dead star, Kalen found an abandoned mining station, its corridors dark and filled with the skeletons of forgotten machines. The walls were etched with graffiti in dozens of languages, messages of anger, despair, and hope long extinguished. Here, Kalen began to build what the Concord believed impossible, a place where humans remembered who they were. He named it Bastion Ardent. It began with only a few, starved miners too weak to continue their work, exiled soldiers whose implants had malfunctioned, and children who had never heard the word freedom spoken without fear. Day by day, Bastion Ardent grew. The abandoned asteroids nearby became training grounds. Miners learned to wield weapons forged from their old tools. Smugglers became pilots. Children became messengers, carrying coded whispers across trade routes the Concord no longer monitored. Kalen never promised victory. Instead, he told them stories. He told of old Earth where people once stood proud and unshackled. He spoke of leaders who had failed, of the price of trust blindly given, and of the danger of forgetting the past. Empires fall, he said softly, but memory endures, and as long as we remember, they will never truly own us. The people listened. They learned. And slowly despair became fire. Kalen's rebellion was not born from anger alone. It was forged from the understanding that history, when silenced, repeats itself. Each scar, each loss became a lesson passed from one person to another. They were not soldiers. They were survivors who had chosen to stop surviving. The galaxy had grown used to humans as compliant servants, a species that no longer questioned its place. But Kalen knew better. Pain, when carried long enough, becomes legacy. And legacy is the seed of resistance. As Bastion Ardent's lights flickered to life above the dead star, Kalen stood on the station's highest platform, watching the cold void stretch endlessly before him. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what might come next, not just revenge, but a world where no child would be born believing they were property. The fires of rebellion had not yet begun to burn, but Kalen could feel it, the quiet heat building, the silent anger that would one day ignite. And when it did, the stars themselves would remember humanity's name. The spark of rebellion had been lit, but a spark alone was not enough. Kalen knew the first true blow had to strike at the very heart of Concord's lies. Kalen Rhine stood in the command chamber of Bastion Ardent, his hands resting on a rusted console that once controlled the mining station's cargo operations. Now, the console had been rewired into a war table. Its cracked surface flickered with faint holograms, showing trade routes, communication lines, and the positions of Concord stations. For years, Kalen and his people had trained in silence. They had learned to fight, to build weapons from scraps, to pilot ships that should not have flown. But training alone would not free humanity. To break the chains, they needed to strike, not just with force, but with meaning. The first target was chosen carefully, Vera Prime, the Valnar propaganda hub. It was the world where broadcasts painted humans as obedient, grateful, and harmless. Its billions of holo screens told the galaxy that Earth's servitude was not cruelty, but harmony. Strike the voice, and the lie will crumble, Kalen told his closest allies. Around the table stood former slaves, smugglers, and ex-soldiers, people who had been broken and discarded by the Concorde. Their faces bore scars, burns, and hollow eyes, but behind that emptiness now burned something fierce: choice. The plan was simple but deadly. A disguised freighter, packed with hidden fighters, would dock at Vera Prime's primary station under the guise of a standard supply run. Once inside, Kalen's fighters would move swiftly through the corridors, seizing the command decks before the Valnar could react. On the day of the strike, silence filled the freighter as it drifted toward its target. Inside, miners clutched rifles built from repurposed drills. Exiled engineers tightened the straps of their patched armor. A young boy, barely 17, sat trembling as he checked the charge on a stolen plasma cutter, his first and likely last weapon. Kalen moved among them, not as a commander issuing orders, but as one of them. "We were taught to kneel," he said softly. "We were taught to forget. Today we teach them what they chose to forget about us." The docking was smooth. No alarms sounded. To the Valnar officers, the freighter was just another shipment of supplies for the propaganda network. The first guard they encountered didn't even reach for his weapon. He was adjusting his translator unit when Kalen's fighter slit his throat. Then, chaos erupted. The corridors filled with the sounds of boots striking metal floors, weapons discharging, and shouts in dozens of languages. The Valnar panicked, unused to fighting humans who did not beg or bow. Within minutes, control rooms were taken, security forces overwhelmed. Kalen reached the central broadcast chamber. The screens around him displayed lies, smiling human laborers, Concord soldiers handing out fake gifts of protection. He turned to the technicians who stared at him in shock. "Leave," he ordered. They fled. Kalen stood before the main console. His voice, calm and steady, echoed through every Valnar transmission network. "You called us property. You erased our names and futures. Today we erase yours. The age of silence is over. We are not your servants. We are the fire you tried to bury, and we will carve our names into your bones." The last words had barely left his lips when the explosions began. Fighter crews planted charges in key systems, setting the station ablaze. Valnar officials ran, some screaming, some still refusing to believe humans could fight back. Within an hour, the propaganda hub was nothing but wreckage drifting in space. The final image broadcast across every Valnar screen was Kalen's face, unmasked, unafraid. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy saw a human not kneeling but standing tall. Far away in labor camps and mining colonies, shackled humans watched that image, and something long buried stirred inside them: memory. Kalen's people escaped before reinforcements arrived. As their freighter vanished into the void, Bastion Ardent received a single, untraceable message from a distant mining colony. "We saw you. We are ready." The first blow had been struck, and with it the chains of fear began to crack. The destruction of Vera Prime sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Fear began to falter, and memory, long buried, started to awaken in enslaved hearts. The destruction of Vera Prime rippled across the galaxy like a silent storm. To the Concord's leaders, it was an inconvenience, a single station lost to an isolated act of rebellion. But to the forgotten humans scattered across mining belts and factory worlds, it was something far greater. It was proof. For the first time in centuries, they had seen one of their own standing unchained, speaking words of defiance not whispered in the dark, but shouted for the stars to hear. In the slave camps of Catharian Roman 9, workers began humming Forbidden Earth songs as they toiled. On the frozen labor colonies of Jareth Prime, prisoners stared at their guards with a new, unsettling boldness. Fear was breaking, and in its place, memory was returning. At Bastion Ardent, Kalen studied fragments of stolen data recovered from the Valnar station's archives. The information revealed something far worse than he had imagined. Humanity's obedience had not been natural, it had been engineered. Long ago, in the early years of the Concord's occupation, scientists had altered human DNA. They had silenced aggression, dampened critical thought, and bred generations who would never resist. Kalen sat in the dim glow of the war table, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Around him were survivors, people who had been sterilized, lobotomized, or mutilated by the Concord's experiments. Each one bore the scars of a system designed to erase humanity's spirit. "They didn't just take our freedom," Kalen said quietly. "They took our will. They thought they could unmake what we are." Silence fell over the room. Then an older man, his face burned from years in the Zirconite mine, spoke in a gravelly voice. "But we're still here. They failed." Kalen looked at them, at every broken face hardened by pain. He realized then that their survival was more than resistance. It was a defiance that the Concord had never understood. "Every species that signed our chains," Kalen said, his voice steady and cold, "everyone that profited from our suffering, they will face judgment, not as enemies of war, but as architects of extinction." From that night forward, Bastion Ardent changed. It was no longer just a refuge. It became a forge. The training intensified. Smugglers taught former slaves how to fly stolen ships. Engineers built weapons from scavenged parts, rifles fashioned from drill casings, explosives made from repurposed mining charges. But the most powerful change was not in their weapons. It was in their hearts. The humans began telling stories, whispered histories of Earth before the Concord, of a time when they were free, when they built their own future without permission. Around campfires in the abandoned asteroids, children sat wide-eyed as elders described oceans, forests, and skies unchained. Kalen watched as fear turned to anger, and anger became resolve. He knew the Concord would see these flames as dangerous. But that was the point. For centuries, humanity's memory had been buried under lies. Now that memory burned like fire, and Kalen understood something the Concord never would. Once memory is awakened, it cannot be chained again. Far beyond Bastion Ardent, in the silent corridors of power, the Orales Concord's leaders dismissed the rebellion as nothing more than a minor uprising. They told each other that humans were too fractured, too broken to rise. But Kalen smiled grimly when he heard the news. "Let them believe that," he said to his closest ally, "because by the time they realize the truth, it will already be too late." But memory alone could not win wars. To fight a powerful empire, Kalen needed more than courage. He needed weapons, ships, and allies from the darkest corners of the galaxy. The fire of rebellion had begun to spread, but Kalen knew that fire alone could not win a war. Bastion Ardent had fighters, but they lacked ships, weapons, and the intelligence needed to strike the Concord where it truly hurt. The Orales Concord controlled the trade routes, the supply lines, and the fuel depots. Without resources, Kalen's rebellion would be nothing more than a flicker against a storm. That was why Kalen turned his eyes to Drosvin Reach once more, not to hide this time, but to bargain with devils. Drosvin Reach was more than a lawless market. It was a festering wound of the galaxy, a place where morality had long since died. Every deal made here was stained with blood. Slavery, organ trafficking, illegal cybernetic trade, and weapons smuggling kept its economy alive. The Concord pretended to despise the Reach, yet its officials secretly relied on its services, turning a blind eye as long as the credits flowed. Kalen sought out Veyric Draws, a name that stirred fear even among the Reach's most hardened criminals. Once a high-ranking broker for the Concord slave trade, Veyric had trafficked thousands of humans to the highest bidders, selling children to alien scientists for genetic experiments, or auctioning them as compliant servants to the galaxy's elites. Kalen walked into Veyric's den alone, armed with nothing but a rusted blade. The room reeked of incense meant to mask the sour odor of blood and old flesh. Veyric, a reptilian creature with pale, scar-pocked skin and filed teeth, lounged on a throne made of bones, some of them unmistakably human. "You must be the ghost they call Kalen Rhine," Veyric hissed, his tongue flicking as he studied the human standing before him. "I expected taller." Kalen's eyes didn't waver. "I expected a corpse," he said calmly. The room went silent. "You came to kill me?" Varric asked, amused. "No," Kalen replied. "I came to offer you a future." Varric tilted his head, intrigued. Kalen explained everything. The rebellion was growing. The Concord would soon see it as a true threat. When that happened, the Concord would not punish the Reach. They would destroy it, leveling the entire sector with orbital strikes to erase the evidence of their own corruption. "But you," Kalen said, stepping closer, "could be more than a broker. Help me now. Give me weapons, fuel, intelligence, and when the Concord burns, you can take their place. Not a middleman anymore, a king." Varric studied him for a long moment, his eyes glinting with a mix of greed and curiosity. Finally, he chuckled, a low, rasping sound that echoed off the bone walls. "I never liked the Concord," Varric admitted. "Too clean, too false, always smiling while they carved your insides out. Perhaps it is time someone else writes the rules." They shook hands. The deal was struck. Androsvin Reach became a silent ally. Weapons flooded into Bastion Ardent. Fuel lines reopened. Black market codes gave Kalen access to Concord encryption keys, troop movements, and starship schematics. But alliances with monsters come with a price. Among Kalen's own fighters, ambition began to grow. Some rebels whispered of power, not freedom. Smugglers who had once fought for survival now dreamed of empires of their own. Even Kalen's most trusted lieutenants began questioning whether they were still liberators, or simply building a new tyranny with different rulers. Kalen felt the shift, but he did not stop it. Not yet. The rebellion needed strength more than purity. As the first shipment of stolen weapons arrived, Kalen stood in the shadows, staring at crates filled with plasma rifles and explosives, tools that could topple colonies in hours. He thought of the lives these weapons would take, of the blood that would be spilled. For a moment, he hesitated. But then he remembered the scars on his people, the sterilized mothers, the children who had never known freedom. "Every empire," he whispered to himself, "is built on choices. Today, I choose to burn theirs to the ground." The rebellion had made its deal with the damned, and the price of that deal would soon come due. The deals Kalen struck brought power, but power revealed truths long buried. Among the secrets recovered was Helix strain, and the horrifying reason humanity had been so easily subdued. The rebellion had grown stronger, but Kalen knew strength alone would never be enough. The Concord had designed humanity to be compliant for generations, shaping their very nature to prevent uprising. Even if the chains were broken, the scars of submission would remain unless something greater was awakened within them. It was late in Bastion Ardent when Selra, Kalen's most skilled slicer, entered the war chamber. Her hands shook as she carried a cracked data slate. She placed it gently on the table as if it were something fragile. "We broke into a restricted Concord archive," she said softly. "Kalen, you need to see this." Kalen leaned forward. His scarred hands rested on the edge of the table as streams of corrupted files filled the display. They were medical records, scientific reports, and encrypted video logs from long before he had been born. At the top of every document was the same designation, Helix strain. The files revealed a truth darker than Kalen had imagined. The Concord had not merely enslaved humanity, they had rewritten them. Through generations of genetic modification, they had dulled aggression, erased the will to rebel, and programmed obedience so deeply that it would pass from parent to child like hair or eye color. But Helix strain had been different. It had been a failed experiment to undo that programming, to create humans who could not be controlled, who carried within them the very traits the Concord feared most: defiance, creativity, and memory of suffering. Kalen's chest tightened as he read the final entry. Subjects deemed too unstable for widespread use. Remaining assets placed in cryostases for further study. Termination of project recommended. He stared at the words for a long moment, then looked up at Selra. "How many?" he asked quietly. 17 pods, she replied. "All still active, coordinates embedded in the files. It's far from Concord space. Forgotten." Kalen's jaw tightened. Forgotten. That was what the Concord did to anything that threatened its control. They buried it, erased it, and waited for memory to fade. "We find them," Kalen said, his voice steady but cold. "If they still live, we wake them." The journey to the coordinates was long and dangerous, through uncharted space littered with the wreckage of dead fleets from wars no one remembered. The cryovault floated in silence near a dying star, its surface scarred by centuries of micrometeoroid impacts. It was not guarded. It didn't need to be. Its existence was a secret even most Concord officials had forgotten. Inside, the air was thin and stale. Rows of pods lined the walls, each one coated in frost. The faces behind the glass were young, peaceful, and unscarred by the horrors Kalen's people had endured. It felt almost wrong to wake them, to drag them from the only dream they had ever known. One by one, the pods were powered up. Steam hissed as locks disengaged. The first to wake was a woman with dark hair and eyes that shimmered with a strange intensity. She gasped, her breath ragged, and looked around in confusion before her gaze found Kalen. "My name," she whispered hoarsely. "Lyra." Kalen stepped forward, offering his hand. "You're safe now," he said. Lyra stared at him as if she recognized something beyond his face. "I know you," she said softly. "Not who you are, but what you are. You burn like the others." As Selra examined Lyra, they discovered something remarkable. Her neural pathways were encoded with data the Concord thought lost forever. Maps, ship schematics, and encrypted communications were woven into her very brain. She was a living archive. Among the recovered data was a single set of coordinates. Beside it, a name written in the ancient tongue of Old Earth: Eclipse Requiem. The files revealed what the Concord had tried so desperately to erase. Eclipse Requiem was not just a warship. It was humanity's final act of defiance before surrender. A colossal vessel armed with weapons powerful enough to end entire worlds. It had been built in secret, ready to launch when the last remnants of Earth's free government realized they could no longer win. But they had never fired it. The Concord had seized the ship before its maiden flight and buried it on a desolate, uninhabitable world. Kalen stared at the projection of the ship, its jagged armor like the folded wings of a predator waiting to strike. "This," he breathed, "isn't just a weapon, it's proof." Lyra stepped closer, her face set with quiet resolve. "They buried our fire, but it still waits for us." Kalen looked at her, at Selra, at the others gathered in the chamber. For years he had fought in the shadows, building a rebellion from scraps and whispers. But now, with Eclipse Requiem, they could bring the war into the open. Yet deep inside, Kalen felt something heavier than hope. He realized that power alone would not save humanity. A ship could break planets, but it could not heal a people who had forgotten how to be free. "We will take it back," Kalen said finally. "But if we are to rise again, we must remember why we fight. We cannot build new chains while breaking the old ones." His words settled over the room like a quiet vow. Around him, scarred survivors, miners, smugglers, and former slaves, watched him with a new light in their eyes. For the first time, Kalen felt not just the weight of vengeance, but of responsibility. The ghost of who they once were had begun to stir. And soon, that ghost would not merely haunt the galaxy, it would change it forever. Lyra's memories carried something even greater. The location of Eclipse Requiem, humanity's last weapon before surrender. To change the future, they first had to wake the beast from its century-long sleep. The journey to Illith Prime was unlike any the rebels had taken before. The planet hung in the void like a shard of frozen glass, orbiting a dying star that bled pale light across its jagged surface. Electrical storms raged in its skies, twisting into violent spirals that flashed green and blue against the darkness. The world was dead, yet it felt alive, like a predator holding its breath, waiting. Kalen stood on the bridge of the transport skiff as they descended through the turbulent atmosphere. Beside him, Lyra watched the swirling storms with an expression caught between fear and recognition. "It's like it remembers us," she murmured. The skiff shook violently as they pierced the upper layers of the atmosphere. Jagged mountain ridges loomed below, their peaks like the broken teeth of some long-buried titan. Through the howling winds and blinding ice, their scanners finally detected it, a vast chasm carved deep into the planet's crust, its walls smooth and unnaturally precise. "There," Selra said, her voice tight with awe. "They buried it deep." The rebels disembarked in silence, their boots crunching on the brittle ice. The cold was so sharp it burned the lungs with every breath. Kalen led the way toward the fissure, his hand brushing the jagged walls as if touching the scars of history itself. Then, as they rounded a final bend, they saw it. Suspended within the canyon like a slumbering god was Eclipse Requiem. Its hull was obsidian black, its angular armor gleaming faintly under the storm's intermittent flashes. Even dormant, it radiated power, a silent promise of destruction and defiance. No one spoke for several moments. The only sounds were the howling wind and the faint hum of ancient energy fields still pulsing around the ship. Kalen stepped forward, his chest tightening with a strange, heavy familiarity. "It's waiting," he whispered. They entered through a ruptured maintenance hatch, the interior dark and filled with dust that had not been disturbed for a century. Each footstep echoed through the hollow corridors, as if the ship itself were listening. The bridge lay sealed behind a triple-lock genetic key, a security measure from old Earth's final days. For a moment, they feared their mission would end here. But as Kalen approached the console, the locks disengaged with a soft hiss. Lights flickered to life along the walls, casting pale gold reflections across the room. Selra's eyes widened. "It recognizes you," she breathed. Kalen placed his hand on the central control pad. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the entire ship came alive. Engines that had slept for generations roared, their low hum vibrating through the very bones of those standing on the bridge. Displays lit up with cascading data, written in languages the Concord had long since erased. A voice, deep, calm, distinctly human, spoke from the ancient speakers. "Eclipse Requiem online, primary user confirmed, awaiting command." The rebels stood frozen, staring at Kalen as though seeing him for the first time. "This ship," Kalen said softly, "is not just steel, it is memory, the last proof that we were never broken." Lyra stepped closer, her eyes locked on the glowing displays. "It's awake," she whispered. Kalen closed his eyes for a brief moment. The ship pulsed with energy beneath his hand, almost as if it could feel him, recognize him, claim him as its own. But as the lights flared brighter and the engine stabilized, Kalen felt the weight of what had just been unleashed. Power like this had ended civilizations before. It could easily turn them into the very monsters they fought against. He opened his eyes, looking at his crew, scarred survivors, outcasts, people who had suffered more than anyone should. "We will use this ship," he said, "but not as they would have used it. We will burn their empire to the ground, and then we will build something better." The bridge fell silent, the only sound the steady heartbeat of Eclipse Requiem's awakened core. For the first time in centuries, humanity had a weapon that could bring empires to their knees. But Kalen knew that true power was never just about destruction. It was about what came after. With the Eclipse Requiem awakened, the rebellion no longer fought in the shadows. But the more power they gained, the more Kalen saw the rebellion changing, and not entirely for the better. The Eclipse Requiem had been awake for only a short time, but already its shadow stretched across the stars. Colonies that had once mocked humanity as docile now whispered its name in fear. Fleets that had enslaved Kalen's people for generations burned in silent orbit, their wreckage drifting like monuments to vengeance. Every strike was brutal, precise, and without mercy. No prisoners. No negotiations, no room for forgiveness. To many of the rebels, this was justice, centuries of humiliation repaid in kind. But Kalen felt something heavy growing inside him. Every victory felt sharper, more hollow. The faces of the fallen haunted his dreams, not just the enemies he killed, but the humans who had followed him to their deaths. One night, as the ship moved silently through the void after destroying a Concorde weapons convoy, Kalen stood alone in the observation deck. Outside the viewport, fragments of burning metal still glowed as they tumbled through the black. He watched them drift apart slowly, like dying embers fading into the cold. Joran Talek entered quietly. His armor was still scorched from the battle, his eyes dark and tired. "You're winning," Talek said softly, his voice carrying both pride and sorrow. Kalen didn't reply. "You should be proud," Talek continued. "The galaxy is finally afraid of us." Kalen turned to him, his face unreadable. "Fear is not the same as respect, Talek." Talek stepped closer. "Do you hear yourself? We didn't start this to make them respect us. We started this to free our people. And we are freeing them," Kalen replied sharply. "No," Talek said, his voice like a blade. "We're not freeing anyone. We're killing everyone who ever raised a hand against us, and we're calling it liberation." Kalen felt anger flare in his chest, but beneath it was something worse, agreement. Talek's gaze was steady, unflinching. "We're not soldiers anymore, Kalen. We're executioners. Whole outposts are surrendering, begging for mercy, and we burn them down anyway." "They stood by while we were chained," Kalen said, his voice quiet but cold. "Some of them did," Talek replied. "But vengeance isn't a future, it's a fire, and fire doesn't care what it burns." The words struck deep. Kalen had always believed that justice required strength, that the weak could never demand fairness from the powerful. But now, standing on the deck of a ship built to destroy worlds, he wondered if strength alone was enough. That night, Kalen walked the silent corridors of Eclipse Requiem. The ship pulsed faintly, its systems alive with energy, almost as if it could feel his thoughts. It was more than steel and circuits. It was a relic of a forgotten dream, a final scream of resistance forged into metal. Yet the more Kalen looked at it, the more it felt like a mirror. It reflected the rebellion's rage, their grief, and their thirst for vengeance. Every time it unleashed its fury, it became harder to tell who they were fighting for: justice or the satisfaction of revenge. In the mess hall, Kalen passed groups of rebels laughing, celebrating the latest victory. They no longer spoke of freedom, they spoke of power, of control, of what they would do when the Concorde was gone. Lyra was among them. Once quiet and uncertain, she now carried herself with a chilling confidence. She fought with ferocity, her presence on the battlefield like a spark in dry grass, fast, deadly, unstoppable. Kalen watched her for a long moment. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation, only fire. He turned away. Later, Kalen stood before the crew in the great hall of Eclipse Requiem. The banners of the rebellion hung behind him, stitched from scraps of cloth taken from a dozen colonies. "We are close," Kalen said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "closer than ever to tearing down the chains that bound us for centuries." The crowd roared in approval. "But remember this," he continued, his tone sharpening. "The future we build after this war will decide if we are any better than those we fight. We will not trade their chains for our own." The hall fell silent. Some nodded, others frowned. Kalen could see it, the divide forming, small but dangerous. He left the hall with Talek at his side. "You sounded almost uncertain back there," Talek said quietly. Kalen gave a faint, bitter smile. "Maybe because I am." Talek's hand rested briefly on Kalen's shoulder. "Good. If you weren't, I'd be worried." Kalen stared out a nearby viewport at the endless sea of stars. They had the power to destroy empires now. But as the rebellion grew stronger, Kalen understood the truth he had long ignored. Power without restraint is not freedom. It is simply a new kind of tyranny, and for the first time, Kalen wondered if he was strong enough to stop the fire he had started before it consumed everything. As the war escalated, a new revelation from Lyra's encoded memories uncovered the full truth of Helix strain. The rebellion's fight was no longer just about freedom. It was about protecting the very essence of what made humans who they were. The rebellion's victories came faster than anyone had imagined. With Eclipse Requiem at its heart, Kalen's forces tore through the Concorde's fleets and outposts, dismantling the Empire piece by piece. Yet Kalen knew that war alone could not win humanity's future. One evening, as the crew gathered in the war chamber, Lyra approached Kalen with something clenched in her hands. A shard of an old data core, cracked and scorched but still faintly pulsing with light. "I found this in one of the Concorde archives," she said softly. "It holds records about Helix strain, more than what Selra recovered before." The shard contained decades of buried history, reports from the scientists who had overseen humanity's genetic manipulation. Kalen and the others gathered around as Selra decrypted the files. What they discovered was worse than any of them had imagined. Helix strain had not been a single project. It was the culmination of centuries of experiments, an effort to create a version of humanity that would never rebel. Not through laws, not through fear, but through biology. The files showed charts of altered neural pathways, suppressed aggression responses, and chemical blocks on critical thinking. Generations had been deliberately weakened, taught to obey not just through culture, but through their very DNA. But the files also revealed something else. Helix strain was never perfect, as some humans resisted. Subtle genetic divergences, small errors that could not be fully erased. These divergences carried memory in ways other species could not comprehend, Pain becomes code. One report read, "It is not forgotten, it is passed down." These subjects turn suffering into story and story into rebellion. Kalen stared at the words for a long moment. "This is why they fear us," he whispered. "Not because we fight, but because we remember." Lyra looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. "We are living proof of their failure. Every human who still dares to resist is proof." Another file played, a video log of a scientist, her hair wild and her face streaked with exhaustion. "They think we can be tamed," she said, her voice shaking. "But humanity is not just violence. We carry memory like fire. Even if you silence us for generations, the spark will return. It always returns." The rebels in the chamber stood in stunned silence. For years, they had believed their rebellion was about freedom, but now they saw it for what it truly was, the survival of humanity's identity. Kalen finally spoke, his voice heavy with resolve. "We will not hide these truths. We will show the galaxy everything, the sterilizations, the breeding programs, the erased histories. Every world, every species will see what they chose to ignore." Selra hesitated. "If we release this, the Concord will fracture. Riots will break out across their territories. There will be chaos, not just for them, but for everyone." Kalen looked at her, his expression cold but resolute. "They wanted the galaxy to forget us. We will make sure they never can." Lyra stepped forward. "And when they see the truth, they will understand that this rebellion is not revenge. It is justice." Kalen met her gaze. For a moment, he saw in her the same fire that had burned in the faces of every human who had once stood against impossible odds. That night, the files were transmitted across every channel the Concord could not block. Worlds erupted in outrage. Species that had once profited from humanity's suffering now denied involvement. Others issued apologies, but apologies could not erase centuries of chains. The galaxy had wanted to see humans as harmless, compliant servants. Now it would see them for what they truly were, a people who never forget. And Kalen understood more than ever before that memory was humanity's greatest weapon. But truth alone could not decide humanity's future. With the Concord collapsing, Kalen faced his hardest choice yet, between total vengeance and the hope of something better. The truth of Helix strain shattered the galaxy. Across Concord space, riots erupted. Species that had long benefited from human slavery turned against each other, desperate to deny their own guilt. Former allies of the Concord withdrew their support. And yet, even as the empire fractured, Kalen felt no triumph, only a growing unease. The rebellion had power now, more than Kalen had ever dreamed possible. But with power came a shadow that grew darker each day. Rebel factions began acting on their own, striking not just at Concord soldiers, but at civilians, even entire colonies that had never raised a hand against humanity. In one intercepted transmission, Kalen heard a rebel commander boast of flooding an alien city with toxic gas, killing thousands in the name of vengeance. The man's voice was proud, certain he had done justice. That night, Kalen stood alone in the bridge of Eclipse Requiem, staring at the stars beyond the viewport. The ship systems hummed softly around him, a constant reminder of the power he now held. Talek entered quietly, his expression grim. "They're calling it liberation," Talek said, "but it isn't. We're becoming what we once hated." Kalen didn't answer. Talek stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I followed you because you believed in something more than revenge. Do you still believe in it?" Kalen turned to face him. His eyes looked older than they had weeks before. I don't know, Kalen admitted. Every strike feels easier. Every kill feels more necessary. And every time I tell myself it's for justice. Talek placed a hand on Kalen's shoulder. Justice isn't about what feels right in the moment. It's about the line we refuse to cross. If we destroy everything, then we've learned nothing. The words stayed with Kalen long after Talek left. The next day, Kalen received an unencrypted transmission. On the screen appeared Avon Kales, a hybrid envoy, half human, half Jerry, who had once served as a Concord diplomat. Her eyes were calm but tired, like someone carrying the weight of too many truths. I was born on Earth, she said. I was raised under their care. I have seen what they did to our kind. I have lived it, and that is why I beg you, stop before you become what they always feared us to be. Kalen stared at her. You don't speak for us, he said coldly. No, Avon replied softly. But I remember my mother's voice. I remember the stories she told me before they took her away. I remember the sky. And I know what we become if we stop caring about mercy. For a long moment, Kalen said nothing. Then he cut the transmission, but her words lingered. Later that night, Kalen found Lyra in the training deck, her movements sharp, precise, each strike of her blade filled with cold fury. She had become a symbol of the rebellion, fearless, unyielding. They will never forgive us, she said when she noticed him watching. So why should we forgive them? Kalen studied her carefully. Forgiveness is not for them, he said. It's for us, because if we forget mercy, we stop being human. Lyra paused, her eyes narrowing. Mercy is weakness. No, Kalen replied quietly. Mercy is strength. Anyone can destroy. Only the strong can choose not to. Lyra looked away. She didn't argue, but Kalen could see the conflict burning in her eyes. The next day, the rebellion prepared to strike at the heart of the Concord, Vorali's spire, the seat of its power, the place where every law of human enslavement had been signed. The plan was simple: destroy it utterly, using Eclipse Requiem's main cannon. As Kalen stood on the bridge, the spire filling the viewport, Talek stood beside him. Do you know what happens after this? Talek asked. Kalen's grip tightened on the command console. No, he said honestly. But I know that whatever comes next will define us forever. For a long time he stared at the spire. He imagined the faces of the millions who would die if he gave the order. He imagined the children who would grow up under new chains, forged by those who had once fought for freedom. At last, Kalen spoke. Send a message to every world, he ordered. The message was simple. This tower was built on bones. You have 24 hours to leave. Then we come. The spire was evacuated in less than 6 hours. When the time came, Kalen gave the order, not for the planet cracker, but for a single kinetic strike. The spire collapsed floor by floor, its shimmering walls crumbling into dust. The galaxy watched the symbol of their empire fall, and for the first time, Kalen realized that true victory wasn't about how much power they had taken. It was about the power they chose not to use. As the dust settled, Kalen turned to Talek. This isn't just about destroying what they built, Kalen said. It's about deciding what we become when it's gone. Talek nodded, a faint smile breaking through the grief on his face. That, he said softly, is the man I chose to follow. Kalen's decision would shape not only the rebellion but the legacy of humanity itself. Power could destroy, but it could also rebuild, and what they chose now would echo for centuries. The fall of Vorali's spire echoed across every star system. For the first time in centuries, the heart of the Concord had been shattered, not by fleets or treaties, but by the people it once called property. Entire planets erupted in rebellion, tearing down statues, burning decrees, erasing every symbol of the empire that had enslaved humanity. But Kalen felt no triumph as he stood on the bridge of Eclipse Requiem, watching the spire's broken remains drift in orbit. Around him, his crew celebrated. They spoke of victory, of power, of what they would build when the Concorde was gone. Kalen listened in silence. He remembered every face he had lost, every life taken under his command, every world burned in the name of justice. Later, Talek found him alone in the observation chamber. The stars stretched endlessly outside, quiet and cold. "You did it," Talek said softly. "The galaxy will never forget this day." Kalen didn't look at him. "And what will they remember us as, Talek? Liberators, or executioners who believed vengeance was justice?" Talek didn't answer. Kalen turned to face him. "We have power now, enough to destroy any world, any species that stands against us. But if all we do is burn, we'll just become the empire we hated." That night, Kalen called a gathering of his closest allies, Talek, Selra, Lyra, and the leaders of every rebel faction still loyal to him. The great hall of Eclipse Requiem fell silent as he stepped forward. "We have won," Kalen said. "This is not the end. It is only the beginning. We must decide what comes after." He let the words sink in before continuing. "We can burn every world that enslaved us. We can rule by fear as they once did. And perhaps we would feel justified, but if we do, then the galaxy will not remember us as survivors. It will remember us as tyrants." Lyra's voice cut through the silence. "They gave us no mercy. Why should we give it to them?" Kalen looked at her steadily. "Because mercy is not for them, it is for us. If we lose it, then we have lost what makes us human." The room was still. Some of the rebel leaders looked conflicted, others angry, but Talek nodded, understanding. "The Concorde is finished," Kalen continued. "The truth is out. Let the galaxy see it, let them judge themselves for what they allowed. We will not become their executioners, we will become their reminder." And so, instead of unleashing Eclipse Requiem on the remaining Concorde worlds, Kalen sent a final transmission across every channel. "You called us weak, you called us property, you thought we would forget, but we are still here. We are not your rulers, not your conquerors. We are the proof that memory cannot be erased. Learn from what you built on our suffering, or face what comes next." The message spread like fire. Some rebel factions refused to follow Kalen's path, choosing instead to keep fighting, to keep burning. But many listened. The rebellion fractured, yet hope remained, hope that humanity could rise without repeating the sins of those who had once enslaved them. Years passed. The Concorde fell into ruin, its power broken, its leaders scattered. On a quiet day, Kalen returned to Earth for the first time. The world was scarred, its cities in ruins, but it was free. He walked through the soil where humanity had first stood, feeling the weight of history under his boots. Lyra joined him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you think we can rebuild?" she asked. Kalen looked at the sky, its blue untainted by Concorde banners. "We must," he said softly. "Because if we cannot, then all of this, every sacrifice, was for nothing." Behind them, Eclipse Requiem hung in orbit, silent and dormant. It was no longer a weapon, but a monument, a reminder of what humanity had endured and what they had chosen to become. Kalen closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the wind on his face for the first time in decades. The war was over, and for the first time humanity's future was their own. The war was finally over. Eclipse Requiem no longer served as a weapon but as a monument, a silent reminder of humanity's pain, resilience, and the choice to rise beyond vengeance.